So thanks for coming out. I've been a PT for 20 years. So of the last 10 years of my career, I've been working in the comprehensive outpatient rehab program here at Harborview. And I just want to say that because some of the stuff that Elisa was talking about, you could have the opportunity to come on in and work with us if you're just leaving the inpatient setting and going to be heading to the outpatient setting. You may be coming to see us. Or if you've been out a while and you want to work on particular skills, we'd always be happy to have you come back in and work on some of those things. Unfortunately, most people end up coming in to see us for such things because they're having shoulder pain. So as you probably noted during Elisa's presentation, there was a lot of at least notation in the back about shoulder protection and prevention. And there's a reason for that because we're seeing that as more and more of an issue. So just want to put that out. So of the 10 years I've been at Corp, I've been fortunate to be able to work in our wheelchair seating and positioning clinic. And during that time, I've learned a lot from folks just like you. And so what I've learned the most is that I really don't know much. And therefore, that's why tonight I brought some of my mentors to help me. And they are Bob Villadaki and Aaron Dysart and Eric Bell, who are going to be available at the end for answering some of your questions. So tonight I'm just going to try to briefly touch upon these points. You don't have to read all of this, but first I'm going to talk a little bit about positioning and why that's important as far as driving and handling a power chair. And then we're going to just breeze over the various driver controls. And then from there, we're going to talk about the standard bases out there, power bases, and then get into the more fun stuff, the driving skills. Okay, so why do we want to talk about positioning? Because it is critical that you have a good stable base to have good trunk stability to allow you to then move what you need to move, which is either your arm or your head to control your chair. Here's your base of support, which is your pelvis, and then your trunk, spine. Here, without good support to that, you're going to end up using your arms to hold on instead of drive. Or even if you're at that point, you're going to be using your head to help you balance. Kind of a little bit of what Elisa talked about earlier as far as doing a wheelie. Same idea as just positioning yourself in a chair. So in order to really drive your chair well, you need to be positioned well to begin with. Now, as you can see, that's kind of a standard, kind of static kind of picture. And not everybody is standard or straightforward. So another good example of positioning is this. You can see that she's got good support to her base as well as her back, while thus allowing her to move her arm and be able to drive. But it also allows her a good line of sight so she can see where she's going, and it obviously supports her extremities well. So good positioning doesn't necessarily mean your standard upright sitting position. Here, even though it's not the greatest example, but here this guy is not so well positioned. You can see that gravity's kind of sucking him into the chair. He's got forward head, forward shoulders, and if you asked him to raise both his arms, he'd probably be limited as far as how far he could lift them up. Now we're going to just talk briefly about controls, just to give you kind of general information. The carrot joystick is the standard that you see out there, and that is generally controlled with the thumb and a couple fingers and moved with just fine movement of the hands for those that have it. For those that may have a little bit less hand control, often you'll be using or you'll see a goalpost handle where they can rest their hand there and then do more of the movement or control with the arm coming from the shoulder. The ball and the dome are just another example of a slightly different contact area. Generally it comes down to preference, individual preference, and kind of feel and what they feel like they can get a good grip on. Here's a little bit different kind of situation. The tongue switch on the right there is just that. It's a switch that is adhered to the roof of the mouth and use the tongue to hit the different switches. So this would be for somebody that has very limited control of even their head, and generally they're going with what they do have good control of. They still may be able to move their head, but they may not feel comfortable enough to use it to drive with, so they would be going with this. On the left, you see the chin joystick, and this is usually mounted on a boom that's aligned just in front of the person, and it's set up just so the person can easily reach it with their chin with just minimal head movement, and thus be able to drive the chair. What you may see more commonly out there is the head array on the right, and this is driven with the head by moving the head in different positions to hit the different switches. There's usually switches buried in each one of those pads, along with the technology of proximity switches, which you may now be familiar with as you scan into your parking garage. On the left, you see an example of a sip and puff, and this is utilized by either giving a puff of air or giving a sip of air, or a series of sips and puffs and so forth, to trigger the electronics, your switches, to then give the commands to the chair. Next, we're going to cruise right into the types of power bases. These are the three main standard bases out there, and the reason why we talk about it is because each one handles a little bit differently. And as far as what you go with ends up being what works best for you. And Aaron and Bob can comment on this a little bit later, because I know they both have had several different types of these kind. So as you can see here, the mid wheel is just that the drive wheel is in the middle of the base and pretty much under the seat. The front wheel, obvious, is at the front of the base, and the rear wheel is at the rear of the base. So some of the characteristics of each, I get to get back to my laser. So with the rear wheel drive, this is the one that handles the most like a car, and thus it has a large turning radius and usually is the least maneuverable. So thinking about tight spaces and so forth, which was previously discussed about the issues even in a manual chair, what you may find. Generally with the rear wheel, you'll have the highest outdoor speed and power, and usually a little bit better clearance, even though that's all a matter of scoping out the internet these days and checking out the specs. It can be pretty rough, but powerful at handling obstacles, as you'll see later in the pictures I have. Anti-tips are needed, generally with steep inclines, or as Aaron may attest to, when you do your tilt. With the mid-wheel drive, this is just the opposite. You generally have the tightest turning radius, and thus it's most maneuverable and really good for indoor maneuverability. It does require auxiliary wheels, so you have usually 6 wheels. These are the ones that are pretty common these days. So you have 2 casters in front, 2 casters in the rear. And for the most part, it handles obstacles pretty well, pretty smoothly. Once again, reasonable obstacles. And hill management is good. One of the biggest things here, you have to think about high centering it. So if you can picture the 6 wheels, if you get your front casters going up a steep driveway and you get your rear casters still on the street, your drive wheels are right in the gutter and catching only but air. So generally the thought there is to take it at an angle. One of the few times that they recommend, or we recommend, taking a slope at an angle. And then the front wheel drive is probably a little bit less common, but definitely has some unique features. One is good maneuverability in the sense of making turns, and we're going to talk about this in a moment. The back end fishtails at high speeds, even though this has been improved upon over the last few years with the electronics. They've been able to dampen it and do some fancy controlling, but it still can be an issue. Definitely difficult to learn to back up. At least that was my experience even today when I was moving one of these. Uphill, downhill, without any end tippers, but as you think about it, it's kind of logical. As you head uphill, especially at a steep incline, your weight shifts off the drive wheels, and thus you can lose some traction. For the most part, it's smooth at handling obstacles that are reasonable size, but it does have a chance to high center, and I think part of this is usually there's little anti-tipper casters on the very front of these, and those can be hung up on steeper curbs. Now we're going to get into driving. I'm going to just cover kind of like what Elisa talked about as well, breaking down indoor, outdoor, and some other particular situations. So first, even though this shows a manual chair, it's the best picture I could come up with, but turning radius is critical. And in a manual chair, if you're in one or when you're in yours, as Elisa talked about briefly, you can pop a wheelie and even shorten your turning radius a little bit. Obviously, with a power wheelchair, it's not so easy to do that in tight spaces. So it's something that you need to pay attention to when you're thinking about getting a new chair. So here's an example of the different turning radiuses when you're taking a corner. So just imagine this is one side of the hallway, and then this is the other wall, and this is your corner. So if you're in a front-wheel drive, you can get that front-wheel drive wheel pretty close and just make a nice tight turn because your rear, most of you, is swinging around. Whereas with the mid-wheel, you're going to once again pivot over your axle. So you need to be able to go a little further out before you start the turn. And then of course the rear wheel, once again, is like a car, so you need to go further out to make that turn. Another factor in your turning radius is going with foot rest or leg rest versus a foot plate. As you can see here with the leg rests, they tend to stick out just a little further and a little wider. Whereas with the foot plate, generally the center mounted ones, you're going to be tucked in a little closer to the battery box, as well as your feet are held together a little closer, and thus gives you a nice clearance on the angle there and makes your turning radius just a little tighter. Now, talking about some other particular situations, approaching countertops, you're probably not going to have to go to the aerobatics that this person did to get to the countertop. But you're generally not going to have this ease either, because most of you probably don't have nice open access for your knees and your feet. So generally you end up approaching 45-degree angle or perpendicular, so you can reach out to access the back of the counter, stove, so forth. When you're thinking about speccing out your chair or thinking about your chair and your new home or whatever, you need to be thinking about clearance under desks and tables. And so one measurement you want to think about is your seat to floor height of the chair. And then of course you take into consideration your cushion and your legs. But for the most part, most of the manufacturers now have thought about that, and the chair height has just come down over time. They've really done a nice job of making them compact, so that's less of an issue than it used to be. But there's always exceptions. So carpet. Now, Lisa, of course, talked about this a fair amount because it's a huge factor in manual chair propulsion. But it also can be a factor in power chairs in the sense of generally you're in your lower drive or your lower power setting when you're indoors. And sometimes in medium, medium pile to obviously shag, you're going to have quite a bit of resistance. So one little trick to know is that there is programming. There's a lot packed into programming these days. So there's special features, in particular the turning acceleration and the torque feature can be adjusted to give you just a little more power in those lower drive settings. That can really help as far as maneuvering on carpet. Now we're going to move on to the outdoor skills. As you can see in the picture on the right, and maybe you can't, but this is pretty steep, so obviously somebody not in a chair probably designed that ramp. So generally, slopes and curb cuts are going to be one of the first things you encounter, and Elisa has already talked about that a bit, but it's the same thing with power wheelchairs too, is that you do need to think about how you approach and your momentum to a certain extent. So generally it's best taken straight on and with a little bit of momentum. Now, as you get into something maybe a little more challenging, you need to think about how you're positioning in the chair. So once again, very similar to if you're doing it in a manual. As you can see here, that shifting your weight is key. In this particular setup, he's moved his chair or his seat forward on the base, and thus his weight is coming down like this such that he can get good traction. Then going downhill, once again, the general thought is taking it straight on, obviously going slow and leaning back and using your equipment appropriately. So again, he's tilting backwards. you can see that she doesn't have as much of a tilt, but you can see she definitely isn't leaning forward. Now, as far as traversing slopes, just like Marty had talked about with the manual, you want to take kind of switchbacks to help you get up. As far as, excuse me, with the power wheelchair, one of the tricks of going across like a long driveway, or you're in a parking garage and you got to get across that ramp and so forth, is that you need to be able to adjust your input or drive accordingly, because the weight is going to be pulling your chair downhill. And so you need to be able to have a little bit of finesse or a little bit of that skill of tweaking the joystick so you keep a straight line of travel. Now, for those that are driving with mechanisms which are a little more complex, a little more higher tech, such as the latch system, which is you give a command and that chair then takes that command and continues that input, or in other words, that motion, until you give it yet a different command. That's a latch system. And in those systems, once again, with the programming, they've built in a setup where there's more power that goes to the downside motor to keep you going straight. So there are a lot of cool things that they have been able to implement these days, which makes getting around a lot easier. So obstacle climbing, you keep hearing about this. You see all these pictures. I have a lot of fun ones in here, but really this is the bottom line for what most of you are going to encounter. Is you're going to be encountering standard curb heights anywhere from 3 to 5 inches. You're going to encounter uneven sidewalks and so forth. So for the standard chairs out there, doesn't matter the drive per se, but the drive wheel position. But generally you're going to have only about 3 inches of clearance. So you just need to kind of keep that in mind as you want to go out there and have fun. So railroad tracks, just as Elisa talked about, same principle. You do want to take them straight on. You don't want to get at an angle. It's kind of similar idea as riding a bike. It's easy to catch a wheel and easy to flip over. Now, you think, well, how difficult can it be to tip a power chair? But if you want to, you can tip a power chair. You can flip a power chair. You can do a lot of things with a power chair. But as you can see, like I mentioned briefly before, in a lot of these pictures, these chairs are set up with bigger wheels, higher clearance, and so forth. So they're not generally your standard chair. But this is a fairly standard rear wheel chair that is out there offered. And you can see it's more of skill at this point. And really these railroad tracks is really a ramp, because you can see kind of how it's built up. Now, some of you are going to want to get to the beach. You are going to want to get out there in the sand. And you just got to keep in mind that your power wheelchair weighs a minimum of 300 to 350 pounds. Okay? So just keep that in mind as you think about maybe having to unbury that. So obviously you want to think about going for packed sand or something that's pretty firm. And it's never a bad idea to have somebody with you, obviously. Now, if you're going to be spending a lot of time on the sand, you want to think about maybe getting a specialized chair for that, because most of the chairs, once again, the standard chairs are really not designed for doing a lot in sand. And just like the manual chairs, you really don't want to be getting a lot of muck up into the gears, the motors, your electronics, and so forth. I think it goes without saying that you should watch out for the tide, but I did have a patient once who was busy watching the sunset, and it was not pretty. So mud or water, I think it's kind of self-explanatory, but it's recommended to keep slow speed, stay nice and steady, and try to just get through it the best you can. Try to avoid 2 inches or more. They say, once again, the whole idea is to minimize the splashing of the debris up into the gears and so forth. Rain, something we can't avoid around here. One of the key things, just like you think about driving a car, if you're going to accelerate fast, you're going to lose traction. So you want to think about smooth acceleration and keeping your speed up. One thing I think people do lose track, that a lot of people that I end up seeing coming in, have lost track, or they've not kept up on their air pressure. So maintaining your tire pressure and your treads is very helpful with dealing with slippery surfaces. Snow, if you're heading to the mountains or to the east side, or you live over there, is a fact of life. And from what I've learned from, once again, several of my mentors, several folks I've worked with over the years, they say in the standard chairs, it does work okay. You can get around in, a couple inches of snow. Once again, it depends on if there's ice under there, what kind of slopes you're on, and so forth. But if you're wanting to do more of what the guy is doing in the right, you want to think about who's with you and how many shovels you got. I think this speaks for itself. There's definitely cool chairs out there. You can do a lot. I had to throw this in just because it's a fact of life. Just like being on a bike or being a pedestrian, it's hard to be seen. And I don't know if any of you knew Doug Lefevre. He was a patient of ours for many years. Unfortunately, he was hit by a drunk driver a couple weeks back and killed when he was crossing in the crosswalk. So now talking about ramps, where most of you are going to encounter it is either getting into your van or into your home potentially. In particular here we're looking at ramps that are once again fairly small and compact. So with that you're going to have a certain rise, and the width obviously is going to be pretty narrow. So what I want to just touch upon here is once again turning to your programming and thinking about maximizing or using it to really help you. And so once again the torque is it's like gearing down in your car. It's giving you just a little bit better power to climb. And generally if you have multiple drives, one of those drives are set up to have a little more torque to help you with ramps specifically. The response or sensitivity, I've capitalized these because sometimes these are the names of these features within certain brands, but it's the whole idea of how smooth and literally how responsive your joystick is to your commands. And so that definitely can be adjusted. And just like what Elisa talked about with some of the skills with your manual chair, same thing with your power chair. When you're first getting used to your first chair or your newest chair, everything feels a little different. You want to obviously practice in a situation that feels comfortable before you actually get out there in the real world. And once again, this is another way of using ramps. I think the question was asked earlier about whether power wheelchairs, if you can do a wheelie in power wheelchair. And yes, you can in the right situation and with it set up the right way, but we do not necessarily recommend that. Lifts is another thing that you're going to encounter if you end up using, once again, your own van or the bus, whether it's the paratransit access in our county or the regular bus. And once again, probably some of the best advice is to take somebody with you to help you if you're, one of the first times you have to take it, because just me taking the bus when I haven't taken it in a long time, I get nervous about putting my money in. I can't imagine, trying to drive onto a lift. So it's just good, once again, to kind of have that skill down. And once again, as I mentioned, maximizing your programming to really help you. As far as when you are thinking about a new van or a new chair and you use a van, this one I've been burned on a few times, so I've learned the hard way. But you definitely need to think about your door clearance as well as the inside space of the van and the equipment you're getting. So thus the slide and what's here. So you definitely need to think about your head to your ground measurements. You need to measure the door. You need to think about what kind of front rigging you're going to have, and so forth and so forth. Okay. Then I just want to touch just briefly about maintenance. Battery charging, I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer. It still surprises me today when I have to justify batteries. Sometimes I'm tempted to say because they don't make a long enough extension cord. Anyway, generally every night you plug in, you're good to go. Obviously when your charge is not holding, then it's probably time for new batteries. One thing is if you are on your own or your caregiver is not there at the time you're getting in or out of your chair and you need to set it up, obviously thinking about your charging station and where you want the cords and so forth, where you can easily reach it without having to lean way out of your chair. Tire pressure, as I talked about before, And then, of course, covers. It's easy once you're out there cruising about to kind of take things for granted, and I've had several people who they kind of forget that this is an electronic device, even though there's stickers usually all over it saying, be aware of rain and so forth. So even if you have a little baggie that goes over your controller, or some people approach it with a big poncho that kind of covers everything. Once again, it depends on, are you going to be out and about all day long? Are you going everywhere in your chair, or are you just mainly getting from your van to your house, or, from the bus and so forth? So, brief reference of where I picked up some of this. And now I'm going to ask Aaron and Bob to come up here, and Eric too, and we'll entertain any questions for you. So actually first I'm going to ask a question. So Bob, how long have you been using a chair?
For 13 years.
13 years. And Aaron?
It's my
19th year. And Eric?
It's my 5th.
All right. So you can see we got a variety of experience. And I know that both Eric and Aaron are driving themselves in their vans. And Bob, you have a van that you get driven in, correct? So they have that experience. And I know for sure Bob, I can't remember if Eric, but Bob has definitely done a fair amount of traveling, air travel and so forth. And I know Aaron gets around, sometimes taking his dog and his kids. So got a lot of experience here. So any questions? So the question is, if I got it right, is how long it took you to feel comfortable in your skills in getting around in various environments, or your primary environment?
I'd say maybe 4 months, 6 months at the most.
I'd say about 4.5 years and still learning every day.
And just to note, Eric, when he first left the hospital, he left in a power chair, and then during his time during outpatient therapy and so forth, he started using his manual more and more. And now, when was the last time you used your power?
Last time I got a flat tire.
Yeah. So it's very handy to have several chairs, which all these guys have.
I don't know, it came really quickly just because, these are our legs, and, it's just how we get around. I remember being very dangerous at first, and then just picking it up pretty quickly. Yeah.
So how do you deal with shock and shock absorption? You want to go first?
It's just like potholes. It's keep your eyes open. When you hit it, it's too late. These power chairs have nothing to speak of. It's, mine anyway, has very little for absorbing a bump. The secondary wheels have a little bit of spring to them, but with any luck, I'll never use those. So.
I'd like to ask about safety at intersections. At the intersection I use the most, the curb cut is a fair amount away from the actual corner or where the crosswalks are, and so I feel like I'm going out into traffic, and it's hopefully that the drivers will slow when when I have the right of way. Any comments about what I might do?
Well, I have a corner of that nature myself, and I found wear something of bright colors so you're easily seen, and I'd rather be caught out in the intersection after the light changes red when I'm in the middle of the intersection than jumping out early. I'd rather be hit by the car accelerating than the one that's trying to stop. So.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what I could add other than also maybe writing or calling the city. Let them know it's a dangerous intersection. I don't know how well they would respond. I know in Redmond, where I live, the city actually came in and put a curb cut near my house for me. Yeah. So that might be one idea.
And I've had several people who've had similar issues, and they had to just stick with it, but finally the city did respond. as far as installing a curb cut or moving a telephone pole and changing some things like that. But sometimes you have to be very persistent. All right, I think we'll bring it to a close. Thank you.